The acrid scent of charred wood and scorched earth hit me like a physical blow, a brutal, unforgiving wave that stole the breath from my lungs and replaced it with a hollow, nauseating dread. I stumbled out of my battered pickup, the dust of 1,000 miles clinging to my skin and clothes, the weariness of a cross-country drive a mere whisper compared to the crushing weight in my chest. My farm, my sanctuary, my life's work was gone. The skeletal remains of my barn stood like a blackened monument, its once proud frame now a twisted silhouette against the fading twilight. The chicken coop, once a vibrant hub of clucking and scratching, was a smoldering heap of ash. The vegetable garden, meticulously planned and lovingly tended, was a barren wasteland, the soil blackened and cracked. Even the sturdy oak tree that had stood sentinel for generations, a silent witness to my family's history, was a charred stump, its branches reaching skyward like pleading, broken arms. I sank to my knees, the rough, burnt earth biting into my skin, the tears I had desperately held back finally spilling over. My farm, Harmony Acres, was more than just a piece of land. It was my legacy, my connection to my late grandfather, the man who had taught me everything I knew about the land. It was my escape from the suffocating pressures of the city, a place where I could breathe, create, and find solace in the rhythm of nature. I had left Harmony Acres for a week, a necessary trip to attend a crucial conference on sustainable farming practices. It was a chance to learn, to network, to bring back new ideas to improve my little slice of paradise. I had entrusted my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, with the care of my chickens and the watering of my garden. She was a kind, elderly woman, a longtime resident of the Harmony Ridge Homeowners Association, HOA, and I had never had any reason to doubt her reliability. Now, as I surveyed the devastation, a cold, hard anger began to simmer beneath the grief. How could this happen? What could possibly have caused such widespread destruction? I pulled out my phone, the screen cracked from a previous mishap, and dialed Mrs. Henderson's number. It rang and rang, but there was no answer. I tried again and again, but the silence on the other end was deafening. With a growing sense of unease, I walked towards Mrs. Henderson's house, a small, neat bungalow nestled amidst the identical cookie-cutter homes that comprised the Harmony Ridge development. The lights were off, and the house was shrouded in an eerie silence. I knocked on the door, but there was no response. I peered through the window, but the interior was dark and empty. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. Something was terribly wrong. I returned to my truck, my mind racing, trying to piece together the fragments of this nightmare. I needed answers, and I needed them now. I decided to head to the Harmony Ridge HOA office, a small, prefabricated building located at the entrance of the development. The office was locked, but a light was on inside. I peered through the window and saw a figure hunched over a desk, illuminated by the glow of a computer screen. I knocked on the door, and after a moment, a man with a stern, pinched face opened it. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice sharp and impatient. "My name is Alex Thorne," I said, my voice trembling with anger and grief. "I own Harmony Acres, and my farm has been completely destroyed. I need to know what happened." The man's expression didn't change. He looked at me with a cold, detached gaze. "Ah, yes, Mr. Thorne. We've been expecting you." "Expecting me?" I asked, my voice rising. "What do you mean, expecting me? My farm is gone." "Yes, well, there was a controlled burn," he said, his tone flat and emotionless. "The HOA decided that your property was a fire hazard, and we took the necessary precautions." "A controlled burn?" I repeated, my voice incredulous. "You burned down my farm?" "It was a necessary measure," he said, his voice laced with an air of bureaucratic indifference. "Your property was in violation of several HOA regulations, and we had received numerous complaints from your neighbors." "Complaints?" I asked, my mind reeling. "What complaints? I've never received any complaints." "The chickens, the garden, the general state of disrepair," he said, ticking off the items on his fingers. "Your property was an eyesore, a blight on the community. We had no choice but to take action." "No choice?" I shouted, my anger reaching a boiling point. "You burned down my life's work without even talking to me?" "We sent you a letter," he said, his voice still devoid of emotion. "It outlined the violations and the consequences. You failed to respond, so we proceeded with the controlled burn." "I was out of town," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "I didn't receive any letter. And even if I had, you had no right to do this." "The HOA has the authority to enforce its regulations," he said, his voice as cold as ice. "We acted within our rights." "Rights?" I scoffed. You're talking about rights while you destroyed everything I own? You destroyed my home, my livelihood, my memories. We understand that you're upset, he said, his voice betraying no hint of understanding. But the HOA's primary responsibility is to maintain the aesthetic and safety standards of the community. Your property was a clear violation of those standards. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of his words. They had burned down my farm, my home, and they were talking about aesthetic standards. Who made this decision? I asked, my voice low and dangerous. Who authorized this? The HOA board, he said, his voice unwavering. It was a unanimous decision. I want to see the minutes of that meeting, I said, my voice firm. I want to see the complaints. I want to see everything. That information is confidential, he said, his eyes narrowing. Confidential, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. You burned down my farm, and you're talking about confidentiality? I'm afraid I can't help you any further, he said, his voice dismissive. You'll have to take it up with the HOA board. He turned to go back inside, but I grabbed his arm. You're not going anywhere, I said, my voice hard. I'm not leaving until I get some answers. He tried to shake me off, but I held on tight. Let go of me, he said, his voice rising. You're trespassing. Trespassing, I said, my grip tightening. You burned down my farm, and you're talking about trespassing? He struggled to free himself, but I wouldn't let go. I'm calling the police, he said, his face flushed with anger. Go ahead, I said, my voice cold. Call them. I have nothing to hide. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. I waited, my anger simmering, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do next. A few minutes later, a police car pulled up and 2 officers stepped out. The man from the HOA office, whose name I now knew was Mr. Peterson, explained the situation, painting me as an angry, irrational man who was harassing him. I told my side of the story, my voice shaking with emotion as I described the devastation of my farm. The officers listened patiently, their expressions neutral. We understand that you're upset, sir, one of the officers said, but this is a civil matter. It's between you and the HOA. But they burned down my farm, I said, my voice pleading. They destroyed everything I own. We can't get involved in that, the officer said. You'll have to take it up with the HOA or file a lawsuit. A lawsuit? I said, my voice incredulous. I don't have the money for a lawsuit. I don't have anything. I'm sorry, sir, the officer said, but there's nothing we can do. They told me to leave the HOA office and not to return. I walked away, my head spinning, my heart aching. I felt lost, alone, and utterly defeated. I spent the night in my truck, parked on the side of the road, staring at the blackened ruins of my farm. The moon cast long, eerie shadows, and the smell of smoke hung heavy in the air. I couldn't sleep. My mind was a whirlwind of anger, grief, and confusion. The next morning, I drove into town, a small, sleepy community a few miles from Harmony Ridge. I needed to find a lawyer, someone who could help me navigate this legal quagmire. I found a small law office on Main Street, a place that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. I walked in and was greeted by a friendly receptionist who directed me to a small, cluttered office. A man with a kind face and a shock of gray hair sat behind a desk piled high.